Hello everyone, welcome to the second video about Formula 1 that I'm going to be uploading to this channel. As always, standard comments apply. Please do like, subscribe and do anything else you can to increase engagement with this video. That would be lovely, thank you. So, first on the agenda for today, I was going to talk about the overall championship picture after the first 6 races. We leave the 6th race of the season in Barcelona with Lewis Hamilton in a commanding position as compared to his nearest rival, a 37-point lead over Max Verstappen. If you look purely at likely performance this year, Max Verstappen being in second place may come as a surprise, as Mercedes appear to be so dominant that you would have expected Valtteri Bottas to occupy that second position. But no, it's Max Verstappen, 37 points back, then Valtteri Bottas is 6 points behind him, then Charles Leclerc, Lance Stroll, Alexander Albon, Lando Norris, Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz Jr. and Daniel Ricciardo rounding out the top 10 in the Drivers' Championship standings. And I think it's all still to play for in that middle order, so probably at this stage of the season, the more interesting thing to talk about, and what actually looks a little bit more representative of the way things may end this year, are the top few places, the top 3 places really. Behind that, I think it really will be a running battle. Racing Point perhaps having failed to capitalise as well as they might have on what at points has looked like the second fastest car on track. McLaren seem to have performed, according to the standings, slightly worse than I would have thought based on the pace they've seemed to have at certain points in the season. Albon down there in 6th place when he's obviously in what is a race-winning car this year. So there's room for a lot of movement in that middle order, and I would not be at all surprised to see significant movement from everyone potentially under 3rd place Valtteri Bottas. So, bringing us nicely onto the second thing on my agenda / list of topics to talk about in this video. Verstappen up there in 2nd place. What a performance he's been putting together this year. And actually, I read a well-reasoned explanation of why Verstappen is actually much closer to being in the lead of the championship this year than potentially many people realise. If Lewis Hamilton hadn't been able to get his 3-wheeled Mercedes over the line in that first race at Silverstone, then Verstappen would have picked up that win and would be sitting on, only 2 wins for the season, but in terms of points would actually have gone into the Spanish Grand Prix leading the championship. We could realistically have been talking about a proper championship challenge between Hamilton and Verstappen if it weren't for a couple of things, basically. Verstappen being very unlucky with the DNF in the first Austria race, and Hamilton being incredibly lucky to be able to finish that first Silverstone race with only 3 working tyres. Now, we've obviously seen strong performances from Verstappen in the last few years, but this year for me is perhaps a coming-of-age moment for him. He's really putting together some performances that you would say are the kind of thing that you need to think about winning a championship. You need to be able to put together really solid performances to finish high even when you can't win, and he's pumped in a number of second places, which, beating the other Mercedes is still very impressive, I think, because that Mercedes clearly has a big performance advantage. So even to beat Valtteri Bottas, if you can't quite beat Lewis Hamilton, is still an incredible performance, outperforming that Red Bull, I would say. It's difficult to get a reference point for that because Alex Albon, which we'll come to, he's perhaps not the best benchmark at the moment. He looks like maybe he might be underperforming the car, but I think on the other side of that coin, Verstappen is overperforming it. He's putting together incredible runs, pumping in those 2nd and 3rd place finishes and just a reliable podium scorer. And that's the kind of thing that can win you a championship. I would say standout moments, obviously that win in the second GP at Silverstone, the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, was very impressive. One moment, which I'm sure we all remember, where Verstappen, on the radio to his engineer, was asked to basically drop back a little from, I think it was Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes, because they needed to manage tyres, and obviously tyre management was a big part of that race. And Verstappen came back on the radio and said, "No, I don't agree with that call." Essentially, I mean, this isn't how he put it, but he said, "I need to attack now and challenge now. It's the only time we're going to be close to them, and we need to put them under some pressure." And as it turned out, putting the Mercedes cars under pressure where they weren't able to conserve their tyres is exactly what won Max Verstappen that race. So, yeah, very impressive performance. Anyway, that's all for now on Max Verstappen. Basically, hugely impressive and really coming of age for me. So the next thing on my list of topics to discuss today was the Racing Point Renault protest, now punishment situation. Call it what you will, everyone knows what we're talking about. This is the accusation that the Racing Point car for this year is essentially a copy in many, many respects of the Mercedes 2019 Challenger. Now, this story's been fleshed out enough in the media that I don't really want to go into a blow-by-blow. Suffice it to say, here, obviously, you had a situation where the FIA handed Racing Point I think, €400,000 fine and a 15-point deduction from the championship for the use of brake ducts, which, when they purchased those brake ducts from Mercedes, were not a listed part, in inverted commas, but then, as of the start of this calendar year, became listed parts, which means that so-called customer teams are prohibited from purchasing those parts. They must be designed solely by the team that intends to race them. That's the idea. So, barring some other big scandal blowing up, this is probably going to be the F1 political controversy of the season. And I expect that it may well be towards the end of the season, if even then, that we get a resolution to this long-running saga, because it's clearly something that's going to run and run. There'll be multiple appeals, multiple rounds of appealing, and, it's the kind of thing that we won't know the outcome of, potentially for quite a long time. In terms of my view on the substance, I really hope that the initial FIA ruling is overruled. # Racing Point did nothing wrong. Looking for a moment at the FIA published document in relation to the decision, it's clear that the whole issue centres around whether Racing Point can be said to have designed their rear brake ducts. And the FIA in this document, or the stewards in this document, appear to make a very big point of the fact that the position is different between the front brake ducts and the rear brake ducts. And they say that whilst using a part that originated on the 2019 Mercedes, but was legally purchased as a non-listed part in 2019 and used on Racing Point's 2019 car, is not unlawful, because then apparently that is what is relevant to you having designed that part on your 2020 car. The only reason why essentially the same process wasn't lawful for the rear brake ducts was because Racing Point had neglected to use the Mercedes rear brake duct that they had, again, legally purchased as a non-listed part in 2019 on their 2019 car, because it didn't fit the philosophy of that 2019 Racing Point. But it does, now that they've moved to a more similar to Mercedes philosophy for 2020, it does make sense for them to use the part now. So they've essentially done the same thing. The only major difference is that they didn't use that rear brake duct on their 2019 car. And this, the FIA seems to think in its document, is the main factor in whether Racing Point can be said to have designed the part. Now, to me, that just doesn't make any sense. Design, as they make clear in this document, is not defined in the rules, but surely it is. It must have something to do with the actual process of the origination of the part, not simply when the part had previously been used. So I'm not convinced by the reasoning in the steward's document. There are actually quite a number of typos and grammatical mistakes in that document as well. Overall, not hugely impressed, and I am not surprised that there is going to be an appeal. And I also, if you asked me what I think is likely, although you can never tell with these things, if you asked me what I think is likely, I think it is likely that that original FIA steward's decision will be overturned, or at least, mollified, so that the resulting penalty or consequence for Racing Point is decreased, which I know is not what the majority of the appealing teams are hoping for. But there you go. Next on my list of topics to talk about in this video, and I'll try and keep it somewhat brief because this is now becoming a little long, is Sebastian Vettel and his travails this year. He clearly, I think the prevailing sentiment is that he's going through a bit of a bad breakup with Ferrari. Obviously a hugely shocking decision from Ferrari to get rid, but we'll cover that because I want to talk about Ferrari in more detail in a moment. But for Sebastian Vettel, it's clearly not going well. He doesn't seem to me to have the desire that he used to have when things were good with Ferrari. And obviously he's got a much worse car as a result of various Ferrari things. And potentially for a few races this season he had a crack in the chassis. Who knows how much store you can set by that. But yes, clearly things aren't fantastic for him right now. He did a bit better, obviously, in the most recent Grand Prix in Spain. But overall, yeah, I think very sad, really, to watch Vettel struggling. I always, in the battles between Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, I always supported Lewis Hamilton. But it's still, I think, as a fan of the sport, sad to see Vettel running around towards the rear end of the grid. And, I think we can all only hope that stories about his potential chance to join Aston Martin Racing, which is obviously Racing Point, next year, I personally hope those are true. Obviously, you have to work out exactly which of their current drivers would make way, and that's not an easy question. But do I want to see Vettel in that car, which actually has, like I say, looked like the second best car on the grid and can qualify on the second row, and therefore with a world champion at the wheel could maybe challenge Mercedes on its day? Yes, I absolutely want to see that. So there's some light at the end of the tunnel, but we'll have to wait to see how that story develops. And what a torrid time of it Ferrari is having this year. Obviously has its origins in the 2019 season, if not even earlier than that. Between the 2019 and 2020 seasons, we had the FIA announcing that it had reached a confidential settlement relating to Ferrari's power unit in the 2019 season. And it released a technical directive, which we have now seen, given that we've had a few rounds of racing under that new technical directive, and it clearly has hit the Ferrari engine teams much worse. It's not clear really that it's hit anyone else at all. Maybe it has a little bit, but clearly Ferrari and the teams which buy their power unit have suffered a huge drop in performance. And given that the settlement reached with the FIA was confidential, we can only speculate and assume, but I think it's a fairly strong inference that Ferrari had been doing something suspect in the 2019 season, so, query whether it's actually legitimate for them to have kept their results for that season, but anyway, and the FIA's taken a dim view of it, and this year they're not going to be able to get away with it, because the FIA are onto them. And as a result, they've lost a huge amount of performance relative to Mercedes and the Honda engines in particular, but also relative to everyone, really, the Renault engine as well. It's clear that Ferrari is probably the worst engine on the grid this year. And wow, who would have thought, 12 months ago that we'd be saying that. But yes, so there's their power unit problems. And clearly that feeds into, or is perhaps symptomatic of, a whole raft of organisational problems, personnel problems. People have questioned whether Binotto running the team as well as remaining the technical director is legitimate, whether he is overburdening himself or in fact just depriving the team of another silo of expertise. All these are legitimate questions. I don't profess to be an expert in how to run a Formula One team, but you've got to say that something there is wrong. And I don't know. I certainly think it's far from clear that Binotto is doing a better job than Arrivabene before him, for example. But Ferrari has a long record of chopping and changing its top personnel, and whether that's actually a good thing to do here is kind of open to debate, I suppose. There have been a few very questionable strategy calls this year, but particularly actually over the last few years. At this point, it's a bit of a meme to talk about Ferrari poor strategy, but just taking the most recent race as a microcosm of this, we had those farcical scenes of when Leclerc conked out, had his engine shut down and spin, and the whole kerfuffle taking his belts off and all of that. The engineer just didn't seem to comprehend what Leclerc was asking and telling him. And to be honest, Leclerc didn't help himself because he was slightly misleading about what the whole belt situation. I think he felt a bit embarrassed about that. But there was that, clearly communication issues there. And then you had a lot of people being very critical of Vettel's engineer, who essentially Vettel had asked about what pace he should be doing on his last stint on soft tyres. And the engineer, I think, told him basically to push on them. And then a few laps later, the same engineer comes back on Vettel's radio and asks what he thinks about potentially going to the end on those tyres, which in the end is what he did. And of course, Vettel's response was along the lines of, well, I did ask you about the need to pace myself on these tyres, and obviously we'd be in a much better position if you'd told me. So, I don't really think that's damning of Ferrari. Often teams do need to kind of pivot on the fly when it comes to strategy. I think that probably makes them sound a lot worse than they are. They're clever people running very sophisticated data modeling programs to work out what strategy they should be pursuing. But in microcosm, those are good examples of the kind of slightly lackluster communication and strategizing going on at Ferrari recently. So, Ferrari clearly need to make some changes. I'm not sure what. Obviously, they've got a driver change on the way in that Carlos Sainz is coming in to replace Vettel. But I don't think, as good as Sainz undoubtedly is, I don't really think that's going to be the difference maker when it comes to the things that we've discussed so far here. So we'll see how that goes. So that wraps up the main points of interest I had to talk about the season so far in 2020. There are a few kind of stray items of other business that I'll just mention. So the first is that we've obviously got the interesting prospect of an FIA crackdown on engine modes, party modes, if that's what you want to call them, which seems to be coming into effect now for the next race at Spa. And interestingly, I do wonder to what extent that's connected to the FIA's announcement that it is also apparently separately looking into the engine manufacturer's use of ERS systems, with, I suppose, the inference that maybe there's something that the FIA is not entirely happy about going on with those energy recovery systems and how that energy is fed back into the power unit. So that's very interesting. Other interesting tidbits, I think, in terms of who has had a good performance this year that I haven't spoken about so far, I think George Russell is putting in an incredibly decent showing in that Williams. He now has outqualified his teammate for some crazy amount of consecutive races, both Kubica last year and now obviously Latifi. So it's clear that he's getting the most out of the machinery. Clearly it's not an incredible car, but he is showing that he can extract the absolute maximum, and that no other driver, granted he's maybe not been up against the best, but apparently, from what we can see, no one can really come too close to him in that car, which is always a good sign, always bodes well, and is exactly what you need to do if you're hoping to win yourself a seat higher up the order. I'm personally very excited for the day when we see George Russell in a Mercedes Formula One car. Who else has put in a good performance? Lance Stroll, I think, has done a lot better than a lot of people are giving him credit for in the Racing Point. He has shown this year that he's sorted out his qualifying. His race pace has always been pretty decent. And yeah, he, I think, lies 5th in the championship. He has shown that he's not being absolutely destroyed by Sergio Perez in the same machinery. Nico Hülkenberg came in and did a fair amount better, but you know, I think Lance Stroll is really showing people that he deserves a seat in Formula One. Whether he would have got one on merit is, I think, something that will always be, you know, people will look sceptically at that, but is he showing that he can put in performances that are not embarrassing, that are, you know, at least there or thereabouts with other people who we know are very good racers? Yes, he is doing. So all power to Lance Stroll, long may that continue. And Pierre Gasly has also put in very good performances this year. He is perhaps lining himself up to return to the main Red Bull team, given Alex Albon's travails, but I think we'll have to see really whether they want to go back there. Going back on a big, shocking decision like that is not something that a team like Red Bull is going to do without a lot of consideration. But he's been putting in, you know, decent turn of speed in that Alpha Tauri. So yeah, good for him. Who's doing less well than we might have hoped? Obviously, we've spoken a bit about Alex Albon. Sadly, he doesn't seem to be extracting the most. Probably his best performance so far this year was when he nearly managed to overtake Hamilton to go into second, and possibly would have charged from there to the lead in the first Austrian race. Obviously, as we know, that manoeuvre didn't pay off. But since then, he's been a reasonable amount down on his teammate. You know, he's been lapped by his teammate, so let's not put it too mildly. He's seemingly doing a lot worse than Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen is a very high benchmark, of course, to try and match, but I think Alex Albon probably, if he's to secure a long-term future with that team, needs to do more than he is doing. So we'll see how that develops. Obviously, there's a bit of a sword of Damocles over anyone in the main Red Bull Racing Formula One team. They could potentially be replaced at the drop of a hat. Another person who I think probably could do with a few better weekends this year is Esteban Ocon. He, I think, needs to be a little bit worried about whether his star allure that I think he had when he came into the sport as a Mercedes prodigy is going to be maintained much longer, given that he is seemingly outmatched by Daniel Ricciardo. Now, we know Daniel Ricciardo is extremely good, so that's not necessarily that surprising, but he appears to be outmatched, Esteban Ocon, and he is going to face Fernando Alonso next year, which is, can be a bit of a career killer, if you ask Stoffel Vandoorne. So let's see how that goes, and hopefully he manages to pump in a few better weekends in the near future. So now moving to a third category of drivers for whom I'm not going to say they're having a particularly good or bad year this year, but have a very exciting future ahead of them. Firstly, Daniel Ricciardo, how happy he must be that McLaren, who he's moving to next year, are looking very strong, have got a podium this year, and next year we'll also have Mercedes engines. So personally, I think it's a very good move for Daniel Ricciardo, much better than it would have been if he was going to Ferrari, for instance, because as we know, Ferrari are unlikely to be ahead of McLaren next year. Who else has a very exciting future? Well, by the same token, Lando Norris, he's obviously actually is already having a very good year this year, but all my comments about the McLaren and the Mercedes engines apply for next year as well. So Lando Norris, I think, will also be very happy with how things are turning out. And the third driver who I'm very excited to see how they go next year is Fernando Alonso. How exciting that he's returning to the sport. I never particularly backed him in his contest with Lewis Hamilton, but I do acknowledge that he is a bit of a legend when it comes to motorsport. He is a deserving double champion and incredibly quick and versatile and exciting and mercurial. So we'll see how he goes in that Renault. So I'm going to leave this video there as it is getting on a bit. I hope you've enjoyed this canter through the points of interest for me so far this season. I think 2020 will be remembered as a very interesting year and a very good year, I hope, for Formula One. It's overcome a lot of hardship in the same way that everyone's having to do this year, but it's bounced back with an incredibly exciting calendar full of circuits that we don't always get the chance to visit. And already we've had lots of intrigue, Nico Hülkenberg coming into the Racing Point, the other Racing Point scandal we've spoken about on this video. Lewis Hamilton putting in some absolute masterclasses that will go down in Formula One history as some of the most dominant, strong performances from a driver. And, at the end of it all, he's likely to be cemented, isn't he, as the joint most decorated champion. He almost definitely will take the record for the number of race wins this year. So yeah, we're living through history in more ways than one, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what the rest of the season brings. Granted, there will be some boring races thrown in amongst the mix, as we've already had, but overall, I just think we're so lucky to be witnessing this era for Formula One, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the season as much as I am going to. Thank you, goodbye, and if you would like me to make more of this kind of thing, please do show your appreciation however you think